Picture this. You're serving your country overseas, and your HOA sells your grandfather's land for unpaid dues of 847s. That's exactly what Bethany thought she could get away with. The email hit Tank's phone like a roadside bomb while he was stationed at a forward operating base in Afghanistan. Bethany Cromwell, HOA board president of Willowbrook Estates, had just conducted an illegal foreclosure on his family's homestead, 2.3 acres of Texas soil that meant everything to him and Elena. The helicopter rotors overhead couldn't drown out the sound of his world crashing down as he realized that while he was bleeding for freedom abroad, a suburban tyrant was stealing his inheritance for the price of a used car. Bethany thought distance meant powerlessness. Deployment meant abandonment. She was about to learn that some soldiers never stop fighting, and this particular soldier came from a family that had been protecting Texas land for 3 generations. Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez wasn't just any soldier. He was 3rd-generation military, a diesel mechanic with hands that could fix anything, and a heart bigger than his native Texas. At 34, he'd inherited something precious from his late grandfather, 2.3 acres in Willowbrook Estates, complete with a 1940s farmhouse, a red barn converted to a workshop, and a small pond that reflected the endless Texas sky. This wasn't just property, it was home, where the creak of the old porch swing still echoed with memories of proposing to his wife Elena, where the smell of mesquite wood from his grandfather's hand-built outdoor kitchen seemed to linger in every text Elena sent him during his deployment. Tank and Elena had dreams as big as Texas itself. When he returned from Afghanistan, they'd renovate the farmhouse, start a family, maybe expand his diesel repair business in the converted barn where the sound of cattle lowing from neighboring ranches beyond the subdivision's pristine walls reminded them that real life existed beyond HOA regulations. Elena, an elementary school teacher with infinite patience for both children and military deployments, was holding down the fort while counting days until his return. But every paradise has its snake, and Willowbrook Estates had Bethany Cromwell. Bethany, 52, had been HOA board president for 6 years, long enough to turn petty authority into an art form that would make Napoleon jealous. She drove a white BMW X5 that gleamed like her ambition, lived in the subdivision's largest house, and happened to be married to City Councilman Harold Cromwell, making her a woman who collected power like some people collect stamps. Real estate was her game, control was her addiction, and military families were apparently her favorite targets. 3 months into Tank's deployment, Bethany launched what she probably thought was a masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare, starting with violation notices that would have been laughable if they weren't so malicious. Unapproved exterior paint color for a barn that had been red since 1940, excessive vegetation height for native prairie grasses Tank's grandfather had specifically planted for wildlife, and non-conforming architectural features for an 80-year-old farmhouse that had weathered more storms than Bethany had hot dinners. Elena worked overtime, literally, to pay mounting fines, while Tank dodged roadside bombs half a world away, and when the violations escalated to $200 per day penalties, Elena reached out to other military families in the neighborhood only to discover a chilling pattern. Bethany had a very particular appetite for targeting deployed soldiers. The crunch of expensive shoes on Tank's hand-laid gravel driveway should have been Elena's first warning that vultures were circling. Strangers walked around their property, measuring, photographing, documenting everything with the cold efficiency of an autopsy, and during their nightly video calls, Elena's voice carried a tremor Tank had never heard before, not even when he deployed to the most dangerous combat zones. Then came Bethany's masterstroke. Tank allegedly owed $847 in special assessments for community beautification, and when Elena couldn't produce documentation that was never sent in the first place, Bethany triggered foreclosure proceedings faster than you could say conflict of interest. Over a crackling video connection that made Elena's tears look pixelated, she described the sound of strangers walking through their home, their future, their dreams, while Tank's jaw clenched as he watched his wife's heart break on a laptop screen 8,000 miles away. Bethany had made one critical miscalculation, though. She thought distance meant powerlessness, deployment meant abandonment, and a soldier's oath only applied to foreign enemies. She was about to learn that some fights follow you home, and Tank Rodriguez never lost a fight that mattered. Bethany Cromwell wasn't the type to let sleeping dogs lie. She accelerated the foreclosure timeline like a woman possessed, claiming Tank's military status didn't protect him because he had abandoned the property by deploying. This wasn't just ignorant, it was illegal. Under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, military members on active duty cannot have their property foreclosed without a court order, which Bethany had deliberately avoided like vegetables at a buffet. Elena's hands trembled as she dialed the base legal office, the metallic taste of fear sharp on her tongue. But Tank's JAG lawyers weren't about to let this slide and immediately filed an emergency motion to void the sale, while beginning investigations into SCRA violations that would make Bethany's comfortable world very uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Elena had been doing detective work that would have impressed Sherlock Holmes, spending late nights at the kitchen table surrounded by the smell of cold coffee and determination as she discovered something explosive. Bethany had been buying foreclosed HOA properties through a shell company called Cromwell Holdings LLC and flipping them for massive profits, turning the HOA into her personal real estate empire. When Elena organized other military spouses in the subdivision, they uncovered a pattern more disturbing than anyone imagined. 3 other service members had lost property during deployments. Bethany consistently referred to military families as transients in recorded meetings. And most shocking of all, the HOA had been operating without proper state registration for 2 years. This discovery triggered Tank's counterattack from 8,000 miles away as he coordinated a legal strike that would have made his commanding officers proud, with his unit commander Colonel Patricia Hayes personally calling the Texas Attorney General's office while military legal advocates began flooding local courts with motions like a legal tsunami. Here's what most people don't know about HOAs. They're required to register with the state and follow specific procedures for foreclosure, but many operate in legal gray areas, counting on homeowners being too busy or intimidated to fight back. Always register your military status with your HOA before deploying. It triggers automatic SCRA protections that can save your home. This one simple step could have prevented Bethany's entire scheme, but her arrogance had led her to ignore federal law, and now that ignorance was about to become very expensive. Bethany's response was predictably nuclear as she filed counter-complaints with the city, claiming Tank's property was blighted and posed health hazards, while the sound of her heels clicking aggressively across City Hall's marble floors became Elena's soundtrack of dread. Then she got her husband Harold to fast-track condemnation proceedings through his city council connections. If she couldn't steal the property through foreclosure, she'd have the city seize it through eminent domain. But help was coming from an unexpected source in Jerry Washington, a retired Army colonel who lived 3 streets over and had been quietly documenting HOA violations for years, emerging from the shadows with a file folder thick enough to choke a horse, filled with evidence of Bethany's systematic abuse of power. The real bombshell came when Elena's investigation revealed that Bethany's husband Harold owed over $340,000 in gambling debts to casinos in Louisiana, meaning the foreclosure scheme wasn't just about power, it was about survival, as they were literally stealing homes to pay off Harold's poker addiction. The smell of desperation was starting to override Bethany's expensive perfume, and during crackling video calls that cut in and out like Tank's patience, Elena watched her husband transform from frustrated soldier to calculating strategist who declared she picked the wrong soldier to mess with, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had survived roadside bombs and wouldn't be broken by suburban politics. Between patrols, Tank studied Texas property law with the same intensity he applied to diffusing explosives, his diesel-stained fingers typing legal searches that would soon become Bethany's nightmare, while the community began taking sides as military families whispered in grocery store aisles about Bethany's tactics, and neighbors who had once feared HOA violations started asking questions about their own rights. The smell of rebellion was in the Texas air, mixing with barbecue smoke and the distant sound of cattle lowing beyond the subdivision's artificial boundaries, and Elena could feel the momentum shifting as what started as one woman trying to protect her deployed husband's property was becoming something bigger, a community-wide awakening to the abuse of power that had been hiding behind perfectly manicured lawns and architectural guidelines. Tank was coming home to a war zone, but this time he wouldn't be fighting alone, and Bethany Cromwell was about to learn that some enemies fight back with weapons she'd never encountered: federal law, military brotherhood, and the unstoppable force of a community that had finally had enough. Bethany discovered Tank was fighting back when FBI agents started asking her neighbors casual questions about HOA procedures. Her response was to double down like a gambler with a losing hand. She bribed City Inspector Pete Kowalski to condemn Tank's barn as structurally unsound and scheduled immediate demolition. If she could destroy the most visible symbol of his grandfather's legacy, maybe Tank would give up the fight. The smell of corruption was thick as diesel fumes when Kowalski showed up with his clipboard and guilty expression, declaring that an 80-year-old barn that had survived hurricanes was suddenly a public safety hazard. Elena wasn't about to let them tear down her husband's heritage without a fight. She called Jerry Washington, who arrived 30 minutes later with coffee and a manila folder that would change everything. Jerry had been investigating more than just HOA violations. He'd been digging into the Cromwell's finances with the thoroughness of a man who'd spent 40 years in military intelligence. What he'd found made Elena's blood run cold. Harold Cromwell didn't just owe $340,000 to Louisiana casinos. He'd been using city resources to pay down his debts, authorizing emergency road repairs that went straight to shell companies owned by his gambling buddies. This discovery triggered Jerry to contact his network of retired military legal experts who flooded Tank's JAG team with evidence that turned a simple foreclosure case into a federal investigation spanning multiple states. Jerry explained something called ultra-virus violations, when HOAs exceed their legal authority by enforcing rules that aren't written in their registered covenants. Elena learned that most of Bethany's violations were completely made up. Here's the key insight. HOAs can only enforce rules that are explicitly written in their registered covenants. So document every violation they claim and demand to see the specific bylaw that supports it. This single technique had already helped Jerry overturn dozens of bogus fines in neighboring subdivisions. Bethany's desperation reached new heights when she hired private security to patrol Tank's property and intimidate Elena. Guards parked outside the elementary school where Elena taught, their radio chatter crackling like bacon on Sunday morning as they followed her to the grocery store and bank. Elena's hands shook as she graded papers, her coffee growing cold while she listened for the sound of boots on gravel. But the intimidation campaign backfired spectacularly when parents started asking why armed men were watching their children's teacher. Local reporter Rebecca Martinez got tipped off by Jerry and began investigating the story as part of a series on HOA abuse of military families. Suddenly, Bethany's private war was becoming very public. Rebecca's investigation went viral on social media with #JusticeForTank trending locally, while veterans organizations across Texas pledged support and military families shared their own HOA horror stories. The taste of victory was starting to mix with the ever-present dust of legal documents. From Afghanistan, Tank began studying Texas property law during off-duty hours with the intensity of a man planning a military operation. He discovered something that made his heart race. Willowbrook Estates was originally built on land with mineral rights that were never properly transferred to the developers. This wasn't just interesting, it was potentially explosive. Tank made a cryptic call to his grandfather's old lawyer, sharp-eyed Mr. Pettigrew, now 78 but still remembering every detail of every contract he'd ever written. "Mr. Pettigrew, I need you to dust off some very old files," Tank said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd found his weapon. "It's time to call in some favors." The community was rallying around Elena as she organized what she called the Willowbrook Veterans Alliance. 18 current and former military families who'd been targeted by Bethany's schemes and were ready to fight back together. The sound of Elena's printer working overtime filled the house as she documented every illegal action, every forged signature, every violation of federal law, building a case that would soon bury Bethany under an avalanche of her own corruption. Bethany tried one more desperate gambit, filing a lawsuit claiming Tank's property contained environmental hazards and must be seized under eminent domain for public safety. But her legal maneuvering was becoming increasingly frantic as FBI agents continued their investigation and Harold's gambling debts became public knowledge. The smell of fear was replacing her expensive perfume, and even her expensive Dallas lawyers were starting to return her calls less frequently. Tank's final message to Elena carried the quiet confidence of a soldier who'd found his enemy's weakness. "Baby, she thinks she's fighting a deployed soldier, but I'm coming home soon, and I'm bringing the full weight of the United States military with me. Tell Mr. Pettigrew to have those files ready. Bethany Cromwell is about to learn what happens when you steal from the wrong family." Bethany was beginning to panic, and panic makes people do stupid things. She got Harold to push through an emergency city ordinance declaring military property subject to accelerated municipal review for community safety, essentially giving the city power to seize any military family's home if they deemed it necessary. The ordinance passed at 2 a.m. during a meeting that wasn't properly announced, with only Harold and 2 of his cronies present, the fluorescent lights humming like angry wasps over empty council chambers. Elena had been monitoring city council activities like a hawk, and she discovered something that made her stomach drop faster than a broken elevator. Bethany had forged Tank's signature on HOA documents, claiming he had voluntarily agreed to expedited foreclosure proceedings while deployed. The forgery was sloppy. Tank's real signature had the careful precision of a man who'd signed thousands of military documents, while the fake one looked like a child's attempt at cursive writing. Elena photographed the documents with shaking hands, the taste of copper filling her mouth as she realized how deep Bethany's corruption ran. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was federal mail fraud, and Tank's JAG team immediately filed charges while the FBI opened a full investigation into Cromwell Holdings LLC that would expose a web of financial crimes spanning 3 states. Elena learned something crucial from Jerry's legal research about quiet title actions, legal procedures to establish clear property ownership when disputes arise. If you can prove someone has illegally claimed your property, you can not only get it back, but also collect damages for their fraudulent actions. Always keep original property deeds in a safe deposit box, not at home. Documents stored at home can disappear during convenient break-ins or mysterious fires. The community mobilization was becoming something beautiful to watch, like a neighborhood barn raising but with legal documents instead of lumber. Jerry organized the Willowbrook Veterans Alliance with 18 current and former military families who'd been targeted by Bethany's schemes, turning Elena's house into command central where the sound of her overworked printer mixed with conversations of military spouses sharing horror stories while building an unbreakable case. The smell of fresh coffee and determination filled the air as neighbors who'd once feared speaking up against the HOA suddenly found their voices and their courage. Rebecca Martinez's investigation was gaining national attention, with military advocacy groups rallying to Tank's cause and #JusticeForTank trending nationwide. Veterans organizations shared stories of HOA abuse, and suddenly Bethany's little kingdom was under a microscope that revealed all the ugly details she'd hidden behind perfectly manicured lawns. The irony was delicious. Bethany's attempts to silence one military family had awakened an entire community of warriors who knew how to fight as a unit. Bethany's nuclear option was filing a lawsuit claiming Tank's property contained environmental hazards from old farming chemicals and must be seized under eminent domain for public safety. She hired environmental consultants who conveniently found trace amounts of pesticides that had been legally used for decades, then claimed these posed an immediate threat to the community. But her legal maneuvering was becoming increasingly frantic as FBI agents continued asking uncomfortable questions. Harold's gambling debts became public knowledge, and even her expensive Dallas lawyers started returning her calls less frequently, like fair-weather friends abandoning a sinking ship. From Afghanistan, Tank coordinated with Mr. Pettigrew in conversations that lasted deep into the night, reviewing documents from 1987 that revealed something extraordinary about his grandfather's original land deal. The old lawyer's voice carried excitement as he explained mineral rights, original land grants, and something called the Homestead Provision of 1987 that would soon turn Bethany's world upside down. Tank's voice carried the quiet confidence of a soldier who'd found his enemy's weakness. Mr. Pettigrew has been keeping some very interesting secrets for 36 years, and it's time to let them out. Elena's breaking point came when security guards followed her to the grocery store, watching her shop for milk and bread like she was some kind of criminal. She broke down crying in the cereal aisle between the Cheerios and cornflakes, the smell of floor wax and fluorescent lighting somehow making everything worse. An older woman comforted her, turned out to be Jerry's wife Martha, a retired nurse who offered to help coordinate veteran families and organize their legal documentation. Martha had the gentle strength of someone who'd spent decades caring for others, becoming the emotional backbone that held the alliance together during the darkest moments. The taste of victory was starting to mix with Elena's morning coffee as Tank's final message before the big revelation carried the weight of a man who held all the cards. "Baby, I've been talking to some very interesting people here about military procedures for recovering seized property. Did you know the Army has protocols for dealing with theft of service members' assets? Tell everyone to get ready. It's about to get very interesting back home, and Bethany Cromwell is going to wish she'd never heard the name Rodriguez." Mr. Pettigrew's voice crackled through the international phone line with the excitement of a man who'd been waiting 36 years to spring the perfect trap. "Marcus, your grandfather was the smartest man I ever knew, and he left you something that will blow Bethany Cromwell's world apart." Tank leaned forward in the dusty communications tent, the taste of anticipation sharp on his tongue as the old lawyer explained that his grandfather had never actually sold the mineral rights to the subdivision developers when he sold the surface land in 1987. The 1987 deed contained a clause granting surface development rights only, which meant Tank owned subsurface mineral rights under the entire 847-acre Willowbrook Estates subdivision, including oil, gas, and water rights beneath every house, every street, every perfectly manicured lawn in Bethany's little kingdom. His grandfather had been a shrewd negotiator who suspected oil deposits and retained mineral rights for future generations, but never told 12-year-old Tank because the boy was more interested in baseball than real estate law. Elena's hands trembled as she read the original deed in Mr. Pettigrew's office, the smell of vintage paper and leather from her grandfather-in-law's documents filling her nostrils while the magnitude of the discovery sank in. In Texas, mineral rights can be severed from surface rights and sold separately, creating two distinct types of ownership over the same piece of land. Always verify what rights you actually own when buying property. Mineral rights can be worth millions and are often sold separately from the surface. This explained why Bethany had been so desperate to acquire properties through foreclosure. She wasn't just stealing homes, she was positioning herself to cash in on something much bigger. The kicker that made Elena's heart race was a recent geological survey commissioned by the city for water management that actually revealed significant natural gas deposits under the subdivision. Harold had been secretly meeting with executives from Permian Basin Energy Corporation, trying to buy up mineral rights so they could lease drilling rights for hydraulic fracturing worth an estimated $50 million. The HOA foreclosures weren't just about power or Harold's gambling debts. They were about acquiring properties with mineral rights to sell to energy companies for generational wealth. Mr. Pettigrew's revelation hit like a thunderbolt. "Your grandfather was protecting this land for you, Marcus. He said someday you'd need leverage against people who think money makes them untouchable." Tank now owned the dominant estate. In Texas law, mineral rights supersede surface rights, which meant he could legally prevent any drilling, construction, or even major landscaping throughout the subdivision without his written permission. Bethany had unknowingly helped Tank discover his true inheritance by forcing him to research property records, her greed exposing her own vulnerability like a poker player showing her cards. The irony was so perfect it felt like divine justice. While Bethany was stealing Tank's surface property, she was actually helping him discover that he owned something infinitely more valuable underneath every house in the subdivision. Elena laughed until tears ran down her cheeks as she realized that Harold's secret energy company meetings, all his scheming and corruption, had been about buying something Tank already owned. The sound of Mr. Pettigrew's old safe creaking open after decades seemed to echo with the ghosts of Tank's grandfather's laughter. Tank's voice carried a new confidence during their next video call, his demeanor completely transformed from frustrated victim to master strategist. "Baby, start documenting every single thing they've done to us and our neighbors. We're not just getting our land back, we're about to own this entire situation." Bethany thought she was stealing from a deployed soldier, but she was actually stealing from the man who controls whether her subdivision can even exist. Elena could practically taste the justice brewing as she prepared to watch Bethany's empire crumble under the weight of her own greed. Tank coordinated Operation Homestead via grainy video calls from Afghanistan, turning Elena's kitchen table into a war room where coffee stains mixed with legal documents and the smell of victory was starting to overpower the lingering scent of Bethany's corruption. Elena, Jerry, Mr. Pettigrew, and Tank's JAG lawyers formed an unlikely but unstoppable team, each bringing skills that would soon dismantle Bethany's empire piece by piece. Jerry explained mineral estate dominance in Texas law. Mineral rights are the dominant estate and supersede surface rights, meaning the person who owns what's underground controls what happens on the surface. If you own mineral rights, you control what happens on the surface above them, making Tank the unofficial king of Willowbrook Estates. Elena's intelligence-gathering operation would have impressed CIA analysts as she secretly photographed all HOA board meetings, documented Bethany's luxury purchases including a new BMW and diamond jewelry that sparkled with the shine of stolen money, and tracked Harold's casino visits with the dedication of a private investigator. Jerry mobilized his military network like calling in air support, contacting retired JAG officers, veteran-owned businesses, and military legal aid societies who formed an unofficial legal strike team that communicated through encrypted apps and shared resources like they were planning a mission behind enemy lines. Mr. Pettigrew taught them about adverse possession laws, how HOAs can lose their authority through improper procedures, essentially shooting themselves in the foot through their own incompetence. Keep detailed records of all HOA violations, because their mistakes become your legal ammunition that can destroy them in court. The evidence mountain Elena organized would have made prosecutors weep with joy. Forged signatures that looked like a kindergartner's homework, illegal foreclosure procedures that violated federal law, SCRA violations that carried serious prison time, Harold's conflict of interest as both city councilman and HOA beneficiary, mail fraud from failing to properly notify Tank, and mineral rights fraud from Harold's secret energy company meetings. Rebecca Martinez coordinated with national military advocacy groups, transforming Tank's local story into a symbol of military families fighting corruption that resonated across the country. The story was picked up by Military Family Today magazine and veterans podcasts, creating a media avalanche that would soon bury Bethany under public scrutiny. Tank's commanding officer approved legal assistance deployment, allowing military lawyers to officially represent him as the base legal office treated this as a test case for service member property rights that could set precedent for thousands of military families. Tank learned about municipal bond fraud, when cities issue bonds based on false property valuations to generate revenue through deception. HOA foreclosures that inflate property values for city tax purposes may constitute federal crimes, adding another layer to the criminal charges that were piling up like autumn leaves in a Texas windstorm. The taste of justice was getting stronger with each revelation, mixing with the ever-present dust of legal documents that covered Elena's dining room table like snow. Martha Washington mobilized the military spouses network with the efficiency of a seasoned campaign manager, while retired Colonel Hayes offered testimony that would carry the weight of decades of military service. Local VFW and American Legion chapters pledged support, creating a community coalition that transformed from individual victims into an unstoppable force for justice. The sound of Elena's printer working overtime became the soundtrack of rebellion as they produced evidence that would soon overwhelm Bethany's expensive lawyers. Tank studied negotiation tactics and legal procedures during downtime between patrols, approaching the legal battle with the same methodical precision he used for mission planning. "In the Army, we call this mission planning," he told Elena during one of their crackling video calls. "Same principles apply. Know your enemy, secure your resources, coordinate your attack, and execute with overwhelming force." The timing strategy they developed was military precise. Wait for Tank's return before revealing their hand for maximum impact with the right audience at the right moment. While they planned their legal offensive, Bethany continued making mistakes like a drunk driver heading for a cliff, filing more fraudulent documents, bribing another inspector, and threatening Elena in front of witnesses who were now secretly recording everything. Her desperation was becoming as obvious as her guilt, and even her own lawyers were starting to distance themselves from the sinking ship of her corruption. The smell of her fear was beginning to overpower her expensive perfume as FBI investigators continued asking uncomfortable questions about finances that didn't add up. Jerry's garage had been transformed into a command center that looked like something from a spy movie, with maps of the subdivision, financial charts tracking the Cromwell's corruption, and communication equipment that kept them connected to military legal experts across the country. Tank's psychological preparation included studying the enemy's weaknesses and pressure points, preparing for a confrontation that would be fought not with weapons, but with law, truth, and the unstoppable power of a community that had finally decided to fight back against the bullies who thought money and position made them untouchable. Bethany discovered federal investigators were asking questions when her bank called to inform her that the FBI had requested financial records for Cromwell Holdings LLC, and her response was the desperate move of a cornered animal. She attempted to destroy HOA records by claiming a computer virus had corrupted all files from 2019 to 2023, but the smell of burning paper from her office window told neighbors a different story about her data management techniques. Jerry's wife, Martha, happened to be walking their dog when she noticed suspicious smoke billowing from Bethany's home office, and she casually mentioned to Elena that computer viruses don't usually require matches and lighter fluid to complete their work. Elena's social media post announcing Tank's homecoming in 2 weeks went viral faster than gossip at a church potluck, with the hashtag #WelcomeHomeTank hashtag spreading across military family networks and veteran organizations nationwide. The post included a photo of Tank in uniform with the caption, "Coming home to reclaim what's ours," and within hours it had been shared by thousands of military families who understood the deeper meaning behind those simple words. Bethany's panic was visible from space as she watched the community rally around a soldier she'd tried to crush, her perfectly manicured facade cracking like cheap paint in a Texas heatwave. Bethany's desperate attempt to fast-track property demolition involved offering city crews double-time pay to tear down Tank's barn before bureaucratic delays could interfere. But the crews were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about the rush to destroy an 80-year-old structure that had weathered every storm nature could throw at it. The taste of desperation was evident in Bethany's increasingly frantic phone calls to contractors, her voice rising to frequencies that could summon dogs from 3 counties away as she realized her window of opportunity was closing faster than a steel trap. Elena revealed her secret weapon that would have made intelligence officers proud. She'd been recording all phone conversations with Bethany under Texas's one-party consent law, and these recordings contained admissions of fraud, discrimination, and conspiracy that would make prosecutors dance with joy. The recordings captured Bethany referring to military families as temporary residents who don't deserve permanent rights, admitting she'd backdated violation notices and bragging about her ability to remove undesirable elements from the subdivision through creative interpretation of HOA rules. Jerry organized a welcome home tank celebration in the subdivision's common area, the same space where HOA board meetings were held, and over 200 people RSVP'd within 48 hours, transforming what should have been a private homecoming into a public demonstration of community support. The irony was delicious. Bethany's attempts to isolate Tank had created the largest gathering of military families and supporters in the subdivision's history, turning her domain into enemy territory where she was vastly outnumbered by people who knew how to fight as a coordinated unit. Bethany hired a crisis management firm from Dallas and attempted to settle with Tank for $500,000 to avoid prolonged litigation, including a non-disclosure agreement that would have silenced the growing movement against HOA corruption. But Tank's response, delivered through his JAG lawyers, was simple and devastating. Mrs. Cromwell can keep her blood money. What we want is justice, transparency, and her resignation from any position of authority over military families. The settlement offer revealed just how valuable Bethany thought Tank's silence was worth, confirming that her crimes were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Tank coordinated with base intelligence officers who taught him surveillance detection and evidence preservation techniques that would soon expose the full scope of Bethany's criminal enterprise. Military intelligence specialists don't just fight foreign enemies. They also know how to document domestic corruption with the precision of a surgical strike. Tank learned to identify patterns in financial records, recognize signs of document tampering, and preserve evidence in ways that would survive legal challenges from the most expensive lawyers money could buy. Elena learned about racketeering laws, when multiple crimes form a pattern of illegal enterprise that can trigger federal RICO prosecution. Document everything because 3 or more related crimes can transform individual violations into organized criminal activity with sentences that can span decades. The sound of Elena's heartbeat during secret recordings mixed with the rustle of documents being organized into categories that would soon bury Bethany under an avalanche of her own criminality, while the smell of justice brewing was becoming stronger than the coffee that fueled their late-night planning sessions. National news picked up the story when Good Morning America requested an interview with Tank upon his return, transforming a local HOA dispute into a symbol of military families fighting corruption that resonated across the country. Bethany's final scheme involved filing false police reports claiming Elena was harassing and trespassing by documenting HOA meetings, but the responding officers were veterans themselves who recognized harassment when they saw it, and it wasn't coming from the military wife with a camera. Jerry announced the Welcome Home celebration would include a community meeting to address neighborhood concerns, and Bethany still didn't realize she was walking into the perfectly orchestrated trap that would end her reign of terror forever. Bethany discovered Tank's mineral rights through her own lawyer's panicked research, and her response was the legal equivalent of a nuclear meltdown as she attempted to file an emergency injunction claiming the rights were improperly transferred and should revert to the city through some twisted interpretation of eminent domain law. Her desperation was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife, and even her expensive Dallas lawyers were starting to suggest she might want to consider early retirement in a non-extradition country. The fluorescent lights in the courthouse buzzed like angry hornets as Bethany filed increasingly frantic motions that read like the legal ramblings of someone who'd lost touch with reality. Tank's homecoming preparation involved coordination between Elena, Jerry, and the base public affairs office to film his return for a military family advocacy documentary that would expose HOA corruption to a national audience. The irony was perfect. Bethany's attempts to silence one soldier had created a media spectacle that would shine spotlights into every dark corner of her criminal empire. Elena could taste victory mixing with her morning coffee as she watched reporters from 3 states request interviews and film crews coordinate their coverage of what was becoming the most anticipated homecoming in Texas military history. Bethany's smear campaign involved spreading rumors that Tank had PTSD and was dangerous to the community, lobbying city council to ban the welcome home celebration because of security concerns about a decorated combat veteran returning to his own neighborhood. The smell of her desperation was becoming stronger than a landfill in August as she made phone calls to anyone who would listen, claiming that a soldier who'd served his country with honor was somehow a threat to suburban tranquility. Her attempts to weaponize mental health stigma against veterans backfired spectacularly when military advocacy groups launched counter-campaigns highlighting her discrimination. Harold Cromwell secretly attempted to buy Tank's mineral rights through intermediaries, offering $2 million cash through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, apparently believing that money could still solve problems that had grown beyond the reach of bribery. The offer came with documents so hastily prepared they still had coffee stains and typos, suggesting Harold's gambling addiction had progressed to the point where $2 million seemed like pocket change compared to his mounting debts. Tank's response was delivered through Mr. Pettigrew with the precision of a legal sniper shot. "Tell Mr. Cromwell that my mineral rights are not for sale at any price, but his freedom might be negotiable." Elena testified at a city council meeting that was live-streamed to thousands of viewers, reading Bethany's recorded threats while military families filled the audience like an occupying army of righteousness. Her voice was steady as steel as she played audio recordings of Bethany admitting to forging documents, discriminating against military families, and bragging about her ability to remove undesirable elements from the subdivision. The taste of justice was sweet on Elena's tongue as she watched city council members squirm in their seats, realizing they'd been enabling corruption that was about to explode in their faces. Tank coordinated with military police investigators who specialized in civilian fraud cases, and they agreed to attend his homecoming as honored guests who happened to be experts in financial crimes and corruption. The military doesn't abandon its own, and Tank's case had become a test of whether civilian authorities could protect service members' rights, or if military justice would need to step in. The sound of combat boots on courthouse floors was becoming as familiar as Bethany's clicking heels. But these boots belonged to people who'd sworn oaths to defend justice against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Tank learned about qui tam lawsuits, when private citizens sue on behalf of the government for fraud against public funds, collecting up to 30% of recovered funds as a reward for exposing corruption. If someone defrauds city, county, or federal programs, you can sue them and get paid for doing your civic duty. This knowledge nugget meant Tank could potentially collect millions from exposing Harold's use of city resources to pay gambling debts, turning his fight for justice into a profitable venture that would fund legal aid for other military families facing similar abuse. Over 400 people now plan to attend Tank's homecoming, with local businesses donating food, decorations, and sound equipment while veterans groups drove in from across Texas like an army assembling for the final battle. The smell of barbecue smoke was already mixing with the scent of yellow ribbon banners being hung throughout the subdivision, transforming Bethany's pristine kingdom into a celebration of military service and community solidarity. Elena's tears of relief during Tank's final phone call before departure tasted like victory as she realized her husband was coming home not as a defeated victim, but as a conquering hero. Bethany's psychological break was evident in her 3 a.m. phone calls to Elena, making increasingly desperate threats that Elena recorded with the calm professionalism of someone who knew the game was already over. The FBI served warrants on Cromwell Holdings LLC and City Hall, while Harold's gambling debts became front-page news in the local paper. Tank's final message carried the weight of a man holding all the cards. Tomorrow I come home to our land, and Bethany Cromwell is about to learn what happens when you mess with a soldier's family and discover he owns the ground you're standing on. Over 500 people gathered in Willowbrook Estates Community Center on a crisp Saturday morning that smelled like barbecue smoke and justice, with news crews from Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio setting up cameras while FBI agents in cheap suits mingled with neighbors in Welcome Home Tank t-shirts. The community center had been decorated with American flags, yellow ribbon banners, and enough red, white, and blue bunting to outfit a 4th of July parade, transforming Bethany's sterile HOA meeting space into a patriotic celebration that would have made George Washington weep with pride. Elena waited near the entrance with barely contained excitement, her heart beating like a drum solo as she watched for the convoy that would bring her husband home to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez arrived in full dress uniform, accompanied by his commanding officer Colonel Hayes and a JAG legal team that looked like they could prosecute war crimes before lunch, stepping out of a military convoy that included 2 Humvees and enough documentation to bury Bethany's corruption under a mountain of federal charges. The crowd erupted in applause that could have been heard in Oklahoma, with veterans saluting, children waving flags, and military spouses wiping away tears as Tank walked through the community that had rallied around his fight for justice. The taste of victory was sweet in the Texas air, mixing with the smell of Elena's tears of joy and the distant sound of Bethany's world crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Bethany's surprise attack came like a desperate last stand as she interrupted the celebration with private security and her expensive lawyer, demanding Tank be arrested for trespassing on foreclosed property while waving legal documents that rustled like dead leaves in the wind. She pushed through the crowd with the desperation of a woman who'd bet everything on a losing hand, her voice rising to frequencies that could shatter crystal as she screamed about jurisdiction and property rights to people who knew she was legally and morally bankrupt. The sound of her heels clicking frantically across the community center floor echoed like a death march as she realized the trap she'd walked into. Tank calmly walked to the podium with Elena beside him, the microphone amplifying his voice to carry across a crowd that had fallen silent with anticipation. "Thank you all for this welcome home," he said, his words carrying the weight of a man who'd served his country and returned to find thieves in his backyard. "I have some things to share about Mrs. Cromwell's illegal activities that I think you'll find very interesting." The evidence revelation came like artillery fire. Elena played recorded conversations of Bethany admitting to fraud. Mr. Pettigrew presented the original 1987 deed showing Tank owned mineral rights under the entire subdivision. Jerry displayed photographs of Harold's secret meetings with energy company executives, and the JAG lawyer read federal charges that would put both Cromwells behind bars for decades. Bethany's public meltdown was spectacular to witness as she screamed that Tank was mentally unstable and dangerous, demanding security remove him from her community while foam literally formed at the corners of her mouth. Her expensive suit couldn't hide the stench of fear and desperation that emanated from her like heat from asphalt, and her voice cracked like breaking glass as she realized that every lie she'd told was being exposed in front of cameras that would broadcast her humiliation to the entire country. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the woman who'd terrorized their neighborhood for years revealed herself to be nothing more than a common criminal having a very public nervous breakdown. Tank's devastating response cut through her hysteria like a blade through butter. "Mrs. Cromwell, this is my community, built on my family's land. I own the mineral rights under your house, your streets, and every blade of grass in this subdivision. You've been trying to steal my inheritance to sell drilling rights to fracking companies for $50 million. But the joke's on you. You can't sell what you don't own." The crowd's reaction was thunderous applause mixed with gasps of amazement as neighbors realized the full scope of Bethany's attempted theft, while FBI agents stepped forward with handcuffs that glinted like justice in the morning sunlight. Law enforcement action was swift and satisfying as FBI agents presented warrants for both Cromwell's arrests, military police took statements from witnesses, and local officers removed Bethany's private security for impersonating officers. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was music to Elena's ears as she watched Bethany being led away while trying to maintain her dignity despite mascara running down her cheeks like black tears of defeat. Rebecca Martinez live-streamed Bethany's arrest to thousands of viewers who watched justice being served in real time, the footage going viral within minutes as social media exploded with celebrations of military families finally getting their day in court. Tank's gracious victory speech announced that any neighbors defrauded by the Cromwells would receive compensation from recovered funds, declaring, "This was never about revenge, it was about justice and protecting military families from those who would prey upon their service." The final twist revealed Tank's plan to donate mineral rights revenue to fund legal aid for military families fighting HOA abuse nationwide, transforming his personal victory into a movement that would protect thousands of service members from similar corruption. Bethany received 5 years in federal prison for mail fraud, forgery, and SCRA violations, while Harold got 7 years for corruption and racketeering, with both ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution that would compensate every family they'd defrauded over 6 years of systematic theft. The sound of the judge's gavel falling on their sentences was sweeter than church bells on Sunday morning, and Elena squeezed Tank's hand as they watched justice being served with the precision of a military operation. Harold's gambling debts became someone else's problem, as the casinos learned you can't collect from federal prisoners, while Bethany's real estate license was permanently revoked and her BMW was auctioned to pay legal fees. Tank and Elena renovated the farmhouse with loving care, keeping grandfather's original red barn as a workshop where neighborhood kids learned mechanics and woodworking from a man who understood that fixing things required patience, precision, and respect for what came before. The smell of sawdust and motor oil replaced the stench of corruption as Tank taught young people skills that would serve them for life, while Elena's victory garden grew where Bethany's security guards once parked their intimidation vehicles. The creak of the old porch swing still echoed with memories, but now it carried the sound of children's laughter and the conversations of neighbors who'd learned to trust each other again. Tank established Operation Homestead Foundation with the mineral rights revenue, providing free legal aid to military families facing HOA abuse and helping 47 families recover stolen property within the first year alone. The foundation's success stories read like a catalog of justice served. A Navy family in California got their home back from an illegal foreclosure. An Air Force sergeant in Florida stopped bogus fines that violated federal law, and a Marine in North Carolina exposed an HOA president who'd been embezzling funds for 5 years. Elena became an advocate for military spouse rights, speaking at conferences across the country where her story inspired thousands of families to stand up against corruption and fight for their rights. Willowbrook Estates elected a new HOA board comprised entirely of veterans and military spouses who eliminated punitive fines and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty tyranny. The transformation was remarkable. Violation notices became helpful suggestions, board meetings included refreshments and open discussion, and the community fund was used for playgrounds and veteran memorial gardens instead of financing the president's lifestyle. Tank used his mineral rights leverage to prevent fracking in the subdivision, preserving water quality and property values for all residents while proving that environmental protection and property rights could work together. 1 year later, the subdivision hosted its first annual Homestead Festival, celebrating military families and community cooperation, with local businesses sponsoring booths where veterans shared stories and Tank demonstrated diesel engine repair to fascinated crowds. The festival raised money for military family legal aid while bringing together neighbors who'd learned that standing up to bullies created stronger communities than cowering behind closed doors. The taste of barbecue and the sound of live music filled the air where Bethany's corruption once poisoned relationships, proving that healing was possible when good people decided to work together. Tank's case became legal precedent for military property rights when Congress passed the Rodriguez Amendment strengthening SCRA protections for deployed service members, ensuring that no other military family would face the systematic theft that had targeted them. The amendment required HOAs to verify military status before any enforcement action and created federal penalties for targeting service members during deployment. Tank testified before Congress with Elena beside him, their story becoming part of the legal framework that would protect future generations of military families from predatory HOAs. The national impact continued growing as Tank received calls from military families across the country facing similar abuse, each case adding to the Foundation's mission of protecting those who protect America. "Looks like Operation Homestead is going nationwide," Tank told Elena as they sat on grandfather's porch swing, watching sunset paint the Texas sky, while children played in the distance and the American flag waved gently in the evening breeze. Tank's final wisdom captured the essence of their victory. Sometimes the biggest bullies are just scared people who never learned the difference between power and strength. Real strength protects others. It doesn't prey on them. If you've got an HOA horror story, drop it in the comments. Tank reads every one and sometimes offers advice through the Foundation. Subscribe for more stories about everyday heroes fighting corruption and winning, because next week we're covering City tried to demolish veterans' food truck, so he bought the entire downtown block.
Thank you for tuning in to HOA Stories, where neighbors stand up against HOA Karens and karma comes a-knocking. If you like this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more HOA tales and real-life neighborhood drama each week.